All right, it is the Classic Metal Show right here on theclassicmetalshow.com. And no, that wasn't classic metal. That was something even better. That was a half hour of just straight up great music. That was from the not brand new, but the brand new reissue, I guess, of Genesis Revisited live at Royal Albert Hall. Of course, the name of that number was Supper's Ready. And on the line right now to serve us a little bit of information about that song and this release and his musical adventures are the Rock and Roll Hall of Famer from Genesis himself, Mr. Steve Hackett. Steve, how are you, sir?
Yeah, very well. Nice to talk to you, Chris.
Excellent. Well, Steve, I played Supper's Ready, which I know is an extremely long number, and that's okay because if there's anything that's on Genesis Revisited live at Royal Albert Hall that I think is most representative not only of the period of Genesis that you were in, but maybe of your whole entire career, it's that song with so many parts and changes and, switches of directions throughout the song. It's just a masterpiece, don't you think?
Well, it's funny. When we first recorded it, I thought we've really kind of stuck our neck out, and I don't know whether people are going to go for it. All those years ago, it was by no means certain, but it became a favorite, perhaps the most favorite progressive track of all time, and so I'm very happy to include it in the set as often as I can. Sometimes we have to retire it to do other albums and other stuff, but it's hugely popular, and it typifies Genesis at that particular time when we were very much an albums band, and Peter Gabriel, of course, was the lead singer originally at that time, and a lot of people are more aware of the era when it was Phil Collins, of course,
sure.
with, as lead singer of Genesis. But Peter Gabriel was for many years, and that's what really launched his career at first. So without Pete, I wouldn't have joined the band. He was the guy who phoned me up and auditioned me. So there we go, all those years ago.
Sure. And it's amazing because, in Genesis folklore, for those of us that remember way back then, and I'm 51, so I remember most of it. I won't say that I remember all of it, but I remember a good part of it. It really seems like there's one band called Genesis, but it almost feels like there's two bands called Genesis, because there's that era that you were in, from the beginning until 77 or whatever, that really was album oriented progressive rock. And then there were 3 on, which really went in that more pop era of the band. When you look at that,
that's right.
When you look going backwards and just looking at it as a whole, as somebody that was there, do you feel like it's one band, or do you feel like it's two? Do you look at the pop era with all the hits and think that was something that you helped create?
Well, I guess in a way, without that first era, you wouldn't have had the second era, which coincided with the rise of MTV and all the rest. But we didn't get a lot of radio support in the early days. We basically played a ton of gigs all over the place, and eventually we got ourselves a hit single in 1973. At the same time, John Lennon said that we were one of the bands that he was listening to at that time, and we were still very much a young band struggling to get gigs, and that made a huge difference for us in the band ourselves. Not that media was aware of that, because you couldn't tweet that news. So John Lennon giving an interview in New York in 1973 was never going to change the world for us at that point in time. But I was, hugely grateful that he said that and gave us the time of day, because obviously we'd all grown up as Beatles fans, and those guys were incredibly important to us.
Sure.
Every band really rode in on the coattails of what the Beatles had achieved, which was, if you're talking about world-changing events, they managed to do it by inviting the whole world to be part of their show. Really, once they invited in the Indian musicians and they were working with orchestras, suddenly rock and roll's never the same again. Not in my book and the Genesis book, and all those British bands at that time who were in and around London, being influenced by that and knowing that the shackles were off, so you could virtually do anything at that time. You could be any kind of band, and you didn't have to limit yourself to the 3-minute single anymore. And albums were hugely popular. Again, due to the influence of the Beatles, I would say, from Revolver through to Sgt. Pepper and what followed, it made albums perhaps more hip than singles for a short while, of course. But that was a kind of golden era of albums, and I will forever be influenced by that. To say that not just rock and roll shoulders were broadened by that, but our thinking, and so it is possible to do all kinds of albums these days. You can do vocal albums, you can do instrumental albums, you can do things that are inspired by film soundtracks, by classical music, by jazz, by blues, pop, rock, you name it, and it's possible to do it, and everyone's freed up to release their own albums. You've still got to go in search of your own audience, of course, and so obviously that doesn't change, and the era of videos reigning supreme is no longer there. I think, especially for the long-term musician, that the loneliness of the long-term albums maker, if you know what I mean.
Sure.
You in a way you've got to operate outside that, think outside the box, and try to be true to yourself, I think, and hopefully come up with something that those fans are still going to love, that they can recognize something in it from those early roots, but without being perhaps tied down to them too much.
Sure. Now, Steve, looking back at the very the very earliest points when you first started making music with Genesis, the thing that I look at is there really wasn't a blueprint. Every other band after that has had success in the quote unquote progressive rock world had at least had you guys as a blueprint. And I'm talking about some great bands, King Crimson, Rush, etc. They all could look back at what you did. You guys I know you have love for the Beatles, but at the same time, you couldn't have looked at the Beatles too much other than maybe a little of Sgt. Pepper's and said, okay, well, now we're going to stretch on. So when you guys were being creative and writing those early Nursery Crime or Foxtrot, when you were doing that, how did you even know that you had material that you thought could be crafted into songs or into musical movements?
Well, I think all new music, when you're constructing it, it's all a shot in the dark, and there's got to be a moment of risk. You take a leap of faith on something that may be a very slender, a sparse idea, and you hope that in doing that, something in spirit is going to meet you halfway with it, and it starts to take shape. But it's got to be that shot in the dark, first of all. If you're going to do anything that's surprising or good or new, of course, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. We know that you look back over the whole of music, and first of all, when you're a kid, you listen to what's contemporary, what you're growing up with. But then if you're seriously interested in music, or if you're a filmmaker, you're going to look back. You're going to look back at the greats, and you're not going to bother when something was made. You're just interested in, is this good? Is this, does this have power? Is this still relevant? So you look back at Ravel and Ravel's Bolero and the power of something like that, as I did when I was a 12-year-old when I first bought it, and then I was listening to R&B and tons of stuff, but at the same time, I discovered Bach and Segovia. Practically, maybe 2 years before Hendrix arrived on the scene for us in Britain, and so it's a bit like classical music was a guilty pleasure in a way. I never thought that it was going to affect rock music. I hoped that it would one day, and I hoped that these two separate schools would come together, baroque and blues, perhaps, and eventually they did, and that's, I think, what we have of progressive music. The two roots, I think, that really feed this tree that we still call progressive.
Sure, definitely. Now, Steve, you of the members of Genesis, whether former or current, you are by far the most prolific as far as creating music. I mean, just looking at your career, you've been on 50 or 60 releases, if not more. I mean, you've done, I believe, 20 some records solo releases outside of the 10 or so that you were with Genesis, and of course there's GTR, there's a bunch of, other projects that you've played on, and yet you always come back to Genesis, to your era of Genesis. Why is that? Do you feel almost like you're you're the one that is obligated to keep that era of the music alive?
Well, with live shows, I've tended in recent years to do two halves. The first half is solo stuff. Mm-hmm. The second half is Genesis stuff. Some of the first half are things that I constructed with the Genesis guys in the first place. Like there might be moments on the first solo thing I did in 1975, and it was another three-man team of Genesis that put that together. I think that I always want to play to strengths and give audiences what they need most. And I know that, in a way, it's been a calling card again to dust off those songs and take them out there, and honor that music, honor that era, and try and do versions that are authentic, that people recognize. But at the same time, to change it to the point where it's recognizable, but I might add some extra instrumentation occasionally, to add an orchestra. I don't think it weakens it to do that, to have extra brass or woodwind, or to change,
sure,
like Supper's Ready. I tend to play something like the guitar solo that was on the original, to play it out, but then extend it and go off and take it to the mountains and allow it to be whatever it feels like it wants to be on the night. So the music's playing me. It's not the other way around. I'm part of it, and but I'm letting it lead me,
sure,
and I feel I'm trying to keep the legacy alive of that stuff from that era. At least that's something that Tony Banks said to me. He said, "You're keeping the legacy alive." That's I thought he would criticize me for doing that, but he didn't. I think he's very proud of it, although, the band, some of them distanced themselves from the earlier era to fly the flag for the three-man team, perhaps. But I think it was a team of writers. Mm-hmm. It was a team of people who were all very, very determined, who all went off and did other things, sometimes came back, sometimes not. I think as a team, there was something in Time magazine when in the mid '80s when I had a GTR and with Steve Howe, and Peter Gabriel had Sledgehammer, the big hit, and Genesis had something, and Mike was having something with Mike and the Mechanics, and Time magazine wrote something in the States, and it said that all these guys that were members of Genesis at one time are in the top 20. The Billboard Top 20, and and it was great that they noticed that that was the case. So I'm still very proud of it all.
Sure. No, definitely.
And on it goes. I don't think the music of Genesis from any era is likely to be forgotten, because there are a number of people keeping it alive.
Sure. No, definitely. Well, you're definitely keeping it alive with Genesis Revisited live at Royal Albert Hall, and looking at the packaging itself. If you're a collector, I think you just have to have it. It's a beautiful collection. It's one of the nicest repackaged things I think I've ever seen floated by. Were you part of that piece of it as well as the art and stuff?
The idea really came from Inside Out, who the album had already been released, and then they were saying, some of these live things you've done, it would be nice to do vinyls of them.
Sure.
And the Royal Albert Hall show, of course, yes, it had guests, and it was a memorable evening. So it's now on vinyl, but you get a CD. You get a CD within the package.
Okay.
And so it was an extraordinary evening, and it's great that it's out there again. It's been reformatted for people who like it on CD. It's got the CD inside. For people who like it on vinyl, it's now on vinyl, and great that they're giving it priority all over again, and it was very much a Genesis show. Lots of Genesis favorites on it. I basically wanted to do a kind of flagship British show with the Revisited team, and it went down amazingly well all over again.
Absolutely. Now, one of the people that appears on live at Royal Albert Hall is the late John Wetton, who I know you had a very long working history with. Obviously it's sad that he passed away. Talk about your musical experiences with him, because much like you, storied career that stretched well past probably what most people knew him for.
Well, I think I absolutely loved John. I adored him, and I know I wasn't the only one. I think he's still very much with us in spirit, and it was great that he was on that show, and he would turn up and sing a couple of things at the drop of the hat on pretty much any show anywhere, and I would do the same for him, whether it was a record or something, and we so nearly formed a band several times, but sadly it was not to be. But there is footage, for instance, of another late great pal, Chris Squire.
All right.
When we did a Cruise to the Edge, we were all up on stage together playing for the one and only time, that team, doing All Along the Watchtower. So that's, that was a kind of, let's do an easy song that everyone knows. And it was really John who originally talked me into doing that with his band when I first guested with him. But I met John so many years ago. I'd just seen him with King Crimson round about the time when they'd done Lark's Tongues in Aspic, and there were a bunch of us who were friends, some Genesis guys and some Yes guys, and we all went along to see an out-of-town show of Crimson, and then in those days, I would party all night. I went off to a club in London, and who should walk through the door but the new singer of the new lineup, John Wetton. I said, "Oh, hi, I've just seen you on stage, and how great it was." And he said, "Oh, was it all right?" And I said, "Oh, it was more than all right. It feels, I thought it was wonderful that he was in the band, and I felt that he was, I felt that he was the right successor to Greg Lake at that time. There was something of the heart and warmth of tone in their voices, and I think that he'd grown up in pretty much in the same area as Robert Fripp, and they'd known each other, before all of this. So I think it's all part of the Bournemouth scene, and Bournemouth, Poole, Dorset, all of that. That's sort of British West Country music scene, and John was really. We all felt every time we saw him, we were going to work with him. You were seeing a friend first of all, and the music came second. As soon as he came through the door, that wonderful smile, it would light up. Everyone would just give him a hug. How great to be together. He used to light up the room every time he came in, and you knew it was going to be right. Whatever we were going to do, it was going to be music. It was always going to be great. It was always going to be lovely, and I still adore him.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Now, for you, Steve, what's next? I doubt you're just going to sit around and not do more music. Is there more music on the way?
Yeah, I've been working on an album that is. There are two albums. Basically, I'm working on a rock album. There's another live one due to come out in a few months.
Okay.
From the Selling England show that I did recently. But then I've got a couple of tracks into a new rock album, but I'm doing an acoustic album at home, something that was designed to be something with orchestra. But what we've been doing so far, it's basically been two people so far, and then we'll put it out to other people at some point once we get the lockdown sorted. And it looks like British scientists have developed something which is hot off the press. It's looking very hopeful at this point. It's I'm just watching the news tonight and seeing that they've managed to reduce the amount of deaths via something that's hugely important for the world. Let's hope it's not a false dawn.
Right.
We hope that this is the solution for us all. But all the shows that I had to cancel, or rather were cancelled on me, the tickets will all be honoured for rescheduling.
Okay.
We were halfway through a States tour. We were halfway through that in America, and we had to stop in Philadelphia, and we got the last flight back home. And we've been in lockdown for months now, but it's been a very productive time. I'm probably about 2 tracks off finishing this particular instrumental album, and then I'll follow it hard on the heels with another rock one.
Excellent.
Like to keep the factory fires burning. It's a good time. When you can't do gigs, it's a great time to record.
Exactly. Well, one question doesn't have to do with you, other than I'm just curious of your opinion. I'm sure you've seen your old friend Phil Collins out playing shows and just struggling to not necessarily vocally struggling, but struggling almost sort of crippled in a way, having to sit in a chair because of all the wear and tear from playing and touring and life itself.
Yeah.
Does that sadden you to see Phil out there and maybe make you think, hey, you've made enough money, why don't you retire?
Well, the thing is, I haven't actually seen any of those shows because I've been doing a punishing a touring schedule myself.
Okay.
And so I would sometimes find myself in the same town on the same day, and he might be playing the night before, and I'd be playing the one after, like in Argentina or something like Buenos Aires or Rio. But that's just the way it is. I would love to see a show, and I think it's great. It's great that he's out there and doing it, and he's not throwing in the towel. The power of the spirit has to be stronger than the limitations of the body.
There you go. Perfect. Well, for now, Steve, let's wrap it up with letting people know once again that the latest release, the reissue, is called Genesis Revisited, live at Royal Albert Hall. It is, if you like Genesis, it is a must-have, not a you should have. It's something you should definitely pick up. It's a great reissue with vinyls and CDs and unbelievably nice packaging. And I'll tell you what, Steve, why don't you pick a track from it to wrap the interview up with, and maybe tell us a quick story about it?
Oh, sure, indeed. Yeah. I mean, there's loads of guests on it. You mentioned John Wetton. Now, I've got a feeling that he sang on a track called... I've got a feeling it was Afterglow that he did. I might get mixed up here without the track list.
He did Firth of Fifth.
He did Firth of Fifth. Okay, so Afterglow was Mad. Okay, I know that he's recorded Afterglow with Firth of Fifth. Well, why not have his version of Firth of Fifth? Why not have that? Does that sound good for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's play it right now.
Great.
Check it out. It is Firth of Fifth. It is Steve Hackett right here on your Classic Metal Show.